Okay, let's start. Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to our after hours webinar, Create a Safe Path to a Safe Earth. My name is Dr. Kate Wiley and it is my great pleasure to be facilitating this webinar this evening, where I'm joined by Dr. Liz Boulton, PhD. Hello Liz, how nice to see you here. How are you?
Terrific.
Liz is going to outline her plan tonight, Plan E, which is a concept of a hyper response to the hyper threat that is the climate and ecological crisis. Before Liz speaks, I just want to acknowledge country. So the nation we call Australia is stolen land. First Nations people have never ceded their sovereignty of their land, and respect is owed. Our nation had a chance to show that respect a few weeks ago, and in my opinion, we failed. And yeah, I think we can reflect on that and keep working forwards for First Nations justice. I offer my respects to First Nations people and any First Nations people joining us today. And I am calling from Kaurna land. And hello in Ghana is Namani. So Namani to you all, and thanks for taking the time to be on our webinar. The other thing I want to acknowledge is the planetary health emergency. So mankind has breached the safe operating zone for many planetary health boundaries, including climate change, the biodiversity crisis, land use change, water use, ecological waste like phosphorus and nitrogenous waste, and plastics. And, you know, we live in a time in our planet's history where we really need to be getting on and doing the work of saving our planet. It's time for us to work. And so it's my great pleasure to have Liz here this evening, because her doctorate work is around that. It's about creating a way through, a pathway to the hyper threat that we are faced currently on our planet. So her doctorate work developed Plan E, a grand strategy for the 21st century era of entangled security and hyper threats. It's the world's first climate and eco-centered security strategy. And Liz is a research affiliate with the Climate Change and Insecurity Project, which is a collaboration between Oxford University and the British Army. So a great breadth of knowledge coming to us from Liz today. So very happy to hand over to you now, Liz, and thank you so much for being on our webinar.
Good evening, everyone. Just check that you can hear me okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, firstly, I may quickly acknowledge that I'm standing on the stolen, unceded lands of the Bunurong people, known as St Kilda, Melbourne, Victoria, and I acknowledge elders past and emerging as well. Secondly, I'd like to say a big thank you to the Doctors for the Environment who created this opportunity tonight, and especially the Chair, Dr. John Van de Galen, and our lovely Executive Director, Kate Wiley, who made it all possible. Thank you so much, Kate. In preparation for this talk, I had a look at the DEA website, and I was particularly struck by your Climate Code Green campaign, which was launched 14 years ago, which said that climate is the greatest, talked about climate being the greatest health threat. And it seemed aligned with me as I see it as the greatest security threat. But in general, looking at the breadth of your work on your website, I just want to acknowledge your powerful voice and expansive work on climate and environmental issues over such a long period. So tonight I'm going to present you a new way of thinking about the planetary crisis and a new idea about how we could respond. So it may not be the method, but it may help us stretch or prompt our collective thinking about how we might be able to respond. So I am aware this is a very informed audience, but I'm thinking that some of you might have had an extremely busy day, perhaps doing heart surgery, perhaps counselling people about existential angst or any other sorts of medical emergencies. So I thought it might be good to quickly refresh on where we're all at. So I'll go through it fairly quickly. Some of the references are in the links are in the chat, because I know some of you will know this, but it's just refreshing. So in 2 days, COP28 starts, and there's already been headlines that no change, the fossil fuel industry is fairly entangled with this process, which compromises it. Recently, James Hansen has released a fairly significant paper, and in a nutshell, what he's saying is that global warming is advancing faster than expected, may hit earlier and harder than previously understood, due to underestimating climate sensitivity, the effect of reduced aerosols and other aspects. And with another recent report describes life on planet Earth as being under siege and that humanity's made minimal progress. All year, we've all been seeing extraordinary headlines. As Kate mentioned, we're exceeding 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. There's also been stacks of climate emergency declarations, yet although there's been a declaration, that hasn't translated into an actual emergency response. This paper's not peer-reviewed, but I thought I'd just put it up because I found it interesting. This paper said is that few are questioning the adequacy of the current approach. So everybody's sort of just hanging in there with the Corp method, and they're arguing that we're completely underestimating the level of effort and time that's required to address the problem. And I think that's true. There isn't much research space for developing alternate pathways. It's a bit of a taboo. So with that background, I am going to present an alternate pathway today. So just to give you an overview of what we'll look at is a bit of an overview of the research. I'm going to have to teach you some new terms and concepts that you'll need to sort of get your head around to understand the later parts. Some of the key analytical insights, then go into Plan E, and then have a bit of a talk about its application in the medical sector. I've just had a bit of a brain dump on some ideas. Obviously, I don't have the expertise of the sector, but it's just a prompt thinking. And if we get time, some discussion. So we'll get going. Research overview. Okay, so some of the starting questions I had was that I noticed that people constantly were using this term existential threat, national security threat, the biggest threat, etc., and the health threat. But it's actually not technically treated as a threat in the way that we normally treat. There's actually a mandated method of how we treat formal threats to the nation or and so forth. So I wondered what would happen if we really did treat it as a threat. And also thought, what if we go back to some of the foundations of security policy? And you may have heard of General Karl von Clausewitz, his book on war, sort of quoted endlessly in business forums and so forth. That one of these famous quotes is this idea that war is actually a form of policy. And what's significant about this is that the word policy links to populace. So there is this idea traditionally that policy links to what people, the taxpayers, want, and it should be responsive to the populace. And it raises those questions about, well, who funds the security sector? And of course it is you, the taxpayers. And also who provides people to serve in the security sector? It's the community. They raise the children, who train them, put them through school and all the rest of it, who then later go on to work as pilots or whatever they are, work in the medical field in the security sector. So that the citizenry pay for and provide the security force. So you would think that it should be in their interests. And the whole reason that they do that is the idea, the raison d'etre, is that it is to protect citizens and their interests. That's why you're paying. So then you think, well, what if the civil sector said, well, we want a new security plan? And this links in perhaps with Extinction Rebellion's idea of citizens' assemblies, or perhaps things will get to such an extreme state at some stage in the future that the public will simply demand a new security strategy. So I'm perhaps trying to anticipate, well, what if they did ask for a new strategy? Let's start to do some work on what it could look like. So just want to clarify how my work differs from other climate security work. So on the left, you've got what's the standard approach that's been around for quite over a decade now. And this is this idea that climate is a threat multiplier, or you can see the cooking ingredients up the top. That's the idea that it's not the main threat, it's just another ingredient that contributes to the threat environment. And at the bottom there, of course, all around the world, defence forces help in mopping up after the mess, but they don't do anything to stop the mess happening. So on my side, I'm saying that it isn't a threat multiplier, it is the main threat. Now, this is a bit of this means I have to walk a bit of an intellectual tightrope because there's cons and pros of taking this approach. On the left are all the cons, and there's actually been probably at least 20 years of what's called securitization research. And this is people investigating what happens if you securitize an issue, even perhaps you might be able to relate with COVID. And it's actually a public policy issue, but it gets managed by the security sector. And there's a whole lot of scary things that can happen. The idea it chills cooperation, power and resources grab, that it mutes peaceful voices, that we end up with this top-down, heavy-handed response, like some of the post-apocalyptic movies that we've seen, risk to human rights, and just reduces that whole spirit of enthusiasm, innovation, etc. So it's really been seen as a nightmare and as something, a terrifying militarization of the world would be what it would result in. So it's been really moved away from. And of course, these are risks, and I believe you can mitigate them, and you don't have to do it that way, the scary way. And focusing on these cons, I think, has obscured some of the pros. And some of the pros are that within the sector, there's thousands of years of expertise and learning and study about how to face dangerous, overwhelming threat and chaotic situations where you don't have evidence of what's going to happen. And those tools can be applied to the problem. It's also a different discursive environment, so that brings different eyeballs to the problem. There is the question of accurate language when we're talking about something that's like on track to wipe out all of planetary life. And it sort of discounted the idea that there was any chance to reformulate our complete approach to security. So that's really the sphere that I'm in, which is using these old-fashioned tools, which have been tried and tested over a long time, and reformulating them to our current situation. And I won't go through all of those, but just on the left, there's some of those traditional military methods that are used, and they're mandated in doctrine, like they're the standard things that people use. And they're the ones that I've been applying to the problem. And then on the right is some of the new thinking. Of course, number one is the science and the new policy. Ecological thinking theory. You'll be excited to see neuroscience has had a big influence on Plan E, which overhauls our understanding of how humans make decisions and behave. Decolonization, liberation theory, quantum physics and theories, really overhauling our understanding of matter and how things work and the rules of nature. Other fields, new materialism and feminist and masculinity studies as well. In a nutshell, I can say there that our current approach to security is framed in a very masculine sort of way. There's also one called the So What game, and I just thought I'd just tell a really quick story because this is pretty heavy stuff of one of my favourite memories of my training is when we're in a big room of 200 officer cadets in a big circle with all seated in tiered right seating. And we had this Armoured Corps officer teaching us about analysis and doing the so what. And so what he would say, he would give us a factor, a situation. So, for example, let me just give you one. Okay, the heat wave has taken down the electricity grid. And then he'd clap his hands and he'd go and yell at the whole group and he'd go, so what? And then everyone had to yell out something that what could happen from this, and then just in one word, and then someone else would yell out something else, and someone else would yell out something else. And the way to do it is you have to have a lot of people in the room who can bounce off each other. So someone would say, most of the hospitals won't have power. And then someone else will say, we have to check all the generators. And then someone else will say, well, we may not be able to get the fuel because the fuel won't get in for X, Y, Z. And anyway, whatever the expertise is, people keep bouncing off, and he would keep yelling, and he would say, so what, and so what, and so what does that mean? And what does that mean? And you had to keep going until you tease out all the implications of something. So that's just one of those little tools. And if we get time, we'll do a little bit of that later. I'll move on. Okay, again, going back to Clausewitz. So one of his other quotes is that the threat analysis, understanding the threat environment, is the most important thing. He says it's the first, the grandest, and most decisive act of judgment which the statesman and general exercises. And the reason he says that is when you study military history, so often this is gotten wrong at the start. And you might think of the Iraq War. At one stage, they said it was an insurgency, where in fact what was actually happening was a civil war. So if you get it wrong, you again have the wrong strategy. So there's a lot of thought about, you've got to get the framing right at the start, which echoes many other disciplines, probably the diagnosis in the medical field, and wicked problems research. So with that in mind, I spent a lot of my effort focused on the threat, and what we have here is a simplified view of how a threat analysis and response planning activity is done. It starts off with a very deep understanding of the threat, the specific nature of it, then understanding the threat context. And so I have for the threat, I've defined it as a hyperthreat, but I'll explain more on that as we go. But the second part of it was understanding the threat context. And what you see there is entangled security, which at its most basic level is this idea that now planet, human, and state security elements are all inherently entangled. So it really makes no sense to pursue one of these things without considering the other. So pursuing military action on its own, just to give you an example, a conflict scenario in the South China Sea, without understanding that's where the coral triangle is, and a very important birthplace for coral and a lot of the major fisheries in the world, or understanding the human dimensions of wiping out that fishery, which supports a massive workforce and provides food to humans, it's completely stupid. And similarly with that, but we have to be able to now consider all three at the same time. So the threat analysis, once you define those two things, was to analyse the hyper threat in the context of an entangled security environment, some trial of analytical tools at it, and that led to Plan E. And there's the 4 publications that reflect that journey. So that's an overview of the whole research process. So let's just go into some of the new lingo here. Okay, there's an eco-philosopher called Timothy Morton from the US, and he did something very different in terms of climate communication. In fact, he calls it global warming and insists on that. He says instead of hundreds of statistics about ice melt and parts per million and soil moisture and all the rest of it, he said he turned it into one single thing, which is called a hyper-object. Now, object is a fancy word for thing in philosophy. It just sounds better, I guess. But essentially he's saying it is a thing that is massively distributed in time and space relative to humans. And it's something that we've just never encountered before. So we're completely baffled because it shatters our understanding of reality. Now we just have one strange monster to deal with. And his book goes through, it has a chapter on each of the characteristics of this strange new thing. And it used quite complicated language to describe it, but in layperson's terms, he describes it as being fog-like and spread out everywhere. So if you think about the oxygen in your nose right now, it has a higher parts per million from when you were a child. Spread out in incredibly vast time and space, so you might be able to see the Agent Orange planes dumping Agent Orange in Vietnam there. So the effects of that threat go over generations. It can't be seen in its entirety. You can't sort of point at it and go, there it is. That's the thing we're after. And one of its things, it operates through other objects, so you never actually see it. So you might see the cracked soil, but you don't see global warming itself. And so it's a bit like the wind blowing, rustling the leaves or blowing the curtains in the wind. You don't actually see or hear the wind. Sometimes you just hear its effects. And he says it's beyond human ability to define, manage, or see. Now, just to backtrack a bit, this is important because without going into it too much now, but the whole of the neuroscience of why people aren't absorbing the threat signals of climate is because they find that facts don't communicate meaning, and that humans our precognitive ability to absorb knowledge, we need to activate our senses and get a tangible feel of how the thing smells, feels, and moves. So he is working with that information we know from neuroscience of how to help people grasp new knowledge, because we actually have these neuron pathways that have to be built from scratch, that they don't actually exist. And so we build them through story and through senses and so forth like that, those precognitive things. And it also, that neuroscience also says about the meaning, that we need deep meaning that links to our deep values and understanding of identity and why we're here and all that sort of thing. So again, he goes into the philosophical space, and he says that the meaning of the significance of this hyper object arriving is that it actually humiliates the human being, that we have this existential demotion. So once upon a time, and perhaps some people still now, think that we're, you know, the masters of the planet and we can project manage anything and, you know, sort of godlike. But in fact, this thing is so big and beyond us that it reduces us now to feeling sort of weak, lame, and vulnerable. And that, in fact, is our status against this enormous, overpowering thing. So that concept is a little bit dark for some people, but I think it's quite powerful, and it helps explain why we can't point at it and see it. And it helps with some of the denial arguments of, you know, oh, it's cold out the window, or, you know, that's not, you can say, well, that's not how an hyper object works. You can't see it, you know, etc. So I thought it was a good match for the nature of the threat, with Clausewitz saying, try and understand how this threat moves and feels, so we can think, well, how do we counter something that moves and feels like that? So I've taken that concept and developed it built on it to develop an idea of climate and environmental change as a hyper threat. So what's different is I brought in all array of environmental problems, the whole sphere of microplastics, you know, illegal logging, you know, the whole suite of them, and interconnecting those. But I'm also saying that unlike the climate crisis framing or climate emergency, that actually we're talking about a new form of violence, killing, destruction, and harm. That actually over this century, it is going to, aside from perhaps nuclear or some savage biochemical attack, that it will be one of the predominant methods of violence and killing facing us and other forms of human life over this century. So the nature of violence has changed. And I'm also perhaps a little bit naive, and I'm thinking that I'm recalling that body of knowledge from the security sector of how to respond to overwhelming threat and chaos. I'm thinking that perhaps humanity has still got some agency and some chance. I guess I'm not prepared to give up as yet. So that's its full definition, that it has warlike destructive capabilities that are so diffuse that it's hard to see the enormity of the destruction coherently, nor who's responsible for its hostile actions. And it defies existing human thought and institutional constructs. Okay. So once you have a concept of threat, one of the tools you can throw at it is what's called center of gravity analysis, where you work out, well, what is this threat's most important source of power? What is the factor that we targeted that will cripple it or deflate it the most? What's it dependent on? So I diagnose that its source of power is its freedom of movement. There's no laws or regulations controlling that at the moment. It's sort of a threat that's off the leash. Much of its activity is considered legal. It's infiltrated our government's laws, institutions, our universities and media, and it appears legitimate. So it's a threat that doesn't dress like a threat. So it may be somebody wearing a very smart suit who's gone to Yale University, who's involved in a cancer research charity, and appears by all values as a trustworthy and reliable member of society. But the actions and the decisions they're making are extremely violent and cause a lot of violence. And it's so the enablers of that source of power are the invisibility of this problem, which we know, the control of media and so forth affects that, and the unknowability of it, because it's something we've never really encountered before. And also, the more humans hesitate, the stronger it gets. Okay, so another thing we can throw at it is called just war theory. And when you go into that, it says, well, legal killing of people, which is what occurs in wars, is the state approve it. There have to be extremely good reasons to go to war, to do something that's not normally, way beyond our moral framework. And it says, Nicholas Foshin argues that the three main good reasons for this are the risk of destruction, that if we had some overpowering army coming and it was going to destroy everything, that the risk of destruction is bigger than fighting back. The loss of freedom, so some sort of totalitarian state, and there's also the loss of freedom through descent into chaos. And then there's simple survival reasons, food and water, etc. So I think you could argue that those reasons apply to the hyperthreat, and I would say that they're good reasons not to go to war, but for mobilisation. So one last term that I want to explain and talk about, it's called material security. You'll be familiar with the concept, but it's not that phrasing. So that refers to all the material products that society needs to function, all the tin, the copper, the wood, the fish, the oils, the lubricants, sand, and so forth. And so from post-World War II, it was really seen as a good thing to go out and get as much of these resources as possible. It was all about resources for freedom and the big rebuild of Western society at any rate. From the 1970s, when we started getting these oil shocks, books like Limits to Growth came out, and they started to realise there might be a shortage of these resources. So from this, arguments arose that because material security is so important to the civilian population, that therefore it's appropriate to use tools of force like the CIA or the US military to maintain the system. So this introduces another term which is called systems maintenance. And this is when military and security forces, including the black ops type people, are used to maintain the system that we have. And obviously I think the biggest example of that is the Iraq War, a war essentially fought over oil. So we're using our security forces in fact to support the hyperthreat and maintain the system, not in all cases, but at times and historically. And because this has been done so much, it's had quite an impact on those countries that have been affected by this. And so books like The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman and his original Confessions, that's a book by a man who worked in this area for the CIA. It's actually a job title called Economic Hitman. And so his job was to go into all the coups in South America and all of that, and the assassinations of leaders who wouldn't hand over their resources to multinationals. And he blows the cover on all of this stuff. And another book that's important in this space is Slow Violence by Rob Nixon, and he talks about how destruction of other, particularly outside the Western world, through toxic factories or what's happened in Lagos, Nigeria, the oil exploitation and damage to the environment in that area, it has a violent effect on the population slowly, because it kills their jobs, their livelihood, their health, and slowly kills. It's a slow form of violence. So systems maintenance, the use of this has these terrible consequences down the track. And in fact, this is quite a subject of the times at the moment about the Western world. And there recently this YouTube interview went viral where a very famous Indian newsreader, Rahul Shivankar, was interviewing two people. And it went famous because he was yelling at the wrong person. But because there was a big yelling match, he basically really started saying what he really thinks and going off script a little bit. And he said to the American, he said, you know, don't lecture us here in India, okay? You people in your colonial agenda, you wreck the South, wreck the East, and don't sit there and lecture us. So at the moment, there's a fair bit of hostility towards the West, who've done some pretty brutal activities so that the civilian world can have our material security, and using security forces and quite brutal methods to keep that system going. The system that is the problem we're here to talk about today. I hope you're starting to see that the logic of our current path. So this is particularly important when we get to fossil fuels. So we've got material security leading to systems maintenance burden on the security forces, but this becomes more important when you're talking about military victory and national security, as I've alluded to. Of course, we all know once upon a time fossil fuels were good and led to a lot of prosperity and capability. But this, in wartime, oil was pivotal to victory. So it started to form this link that oil is linked to security. And so then we start asking these questions, well, when is war being fought in support of the hyperthreat? We're fighting wars to get oil, which then makes the hyperthreat stronger, which then will destroy us anyway. It's all getting a bit crazy. And if we continue this way, where resource wars, which might turn to something else like lithium and so forth, if resource wars are the norm, then what does that mean for how do we contain the hyperthreat? And I would actually argue at the moment, I think we are on a trajectory of a fight for what's left pathway from the security sector. So what emerges from this is dual logic. There are two reasons to transform to zero emissions and ecological design, material security constructs. We have to find a new way to provide material security to the civilian population. One, to reduce the hyperthreat of global warming and ecological crisis, but also to reduce the drivers for conflict. Now, I know you can't see that picture at the bottom there of Africa, but all I want to highlight is the areas in pink and dark red are the areas where Russia has mercenary and military forces in as well, just showing that partnership of the security forces with resource extraction. It's not just the West, of course. So I want to draw out some sort of key analytical insights from all of this. Here's a picture of the three main human tribes, those interested in planetary security, those interested in human security, of which the health and medical sector is part of that, and those interested with state security. And something that came out of the analysis was that largely when you look at those groups, largely the planetary security people and the human security people are really doing the best to support a hyper response. But it's quite striking that when you look at the state and what I call industry that's aligned with the state, which I call, so I should have explained, is the resource eagle. So they're those massive big multinational companies that extract resources, and they're resource eagles because they're so big, they're sort of flying high above, and they work in really big maps, big pictures of, quantities of those big resources. And defence industry are in that state zone. But when you actually look at their behaviour, they're actually quite often supporting the hyper threat. So what this actually means is that when you think the state is probably the muscle of society, it's probably, literally some of the people in the community who are the fittest and the strongest, and but also in terms of the money, the resources, the engineering and technological R&D that goes into it, that really it doesn't really matter what happens in the planetary and human security tribes. If the state security sector is misaligned and supporting this new threat, then we won't win. So the answer has to be realigning that state sector and bringing and all groups going the same way. And just to unpack this again, I just want to focus on the three big gears, not the micro issues of these three groups: the climate, environment sector, defence, and the resource eagles. So looking from now to 2030, what's going on? On the left, we have the military sector going through a massive growth spurt, and generally there's this expectation of major conflict, potentially between the East and the West. On the right, top right, we have our climate environmental situation. Within this exact same time period, we have to do a massive decrease of emissions and protect the environment. And then at the bottom, what are the resource eagles also doing over this period? Well, they're also preparing for a growth spurt and expanding fossil fuel. Now, if you look at that diagram, and you look at your defence sector, which you pay for, which of the two on the right is it supporting? You can put an answer in the chat if you like. Well, it's orientated around the resource eagles, I would say. So what I'm thinking, what my concept is well, what if that whole defence sector and that money and that technological engineering capacity move to support the population and the climate and environmental task, and we withdrew that protection? So yeah, the other aspect to highlight is the strategic incoherence of this, because let's just say that there is a World War III, or we just keep going on this process of preparing for it, which has an enormous bill with it, and it's, you know, the time and effort of everyone's brains in the technological industry, that it would derail countering the hyperthreat, so we all sort of end up dead anyway. So let's just hypothetically, let's say China, Russia, Iran win the war. Well, the act of that war occurring would mean that the hyperthreat is enraged and then, you know, wipes out everybody. So there's no coherence, there's no pathway to security actually now through war. And if this slide just sort of reiterates this a little bit further, just to tease it out, because it is a bit of a new idea, and I'm sorry if I'm being a bit repetitive. Major warfare or preparation for major warfare undermines security because it derails capacity to address dangerous global warming and ecological crisis. They're occurring at the exact same time. I might just let you read those subpoints. Obviously, it causes acceleration in greenhouse gases, emissions, ecological damage. And I'm saying it's a new form of mutually assured destruction, in fact, to go to war. And this is just highlighting the main issues that have come out. We have a new form of violence, but also with that, we actually have a new form of conscious intent to cause harm. So that the formal definition of a threat, which is distinguished from a hazard, you know, hazard's something randomly happening, is that there is a knowingness that harm will be caused. There's a conscious decision making involved. And there's a new form, and it's dispersed and filtered through a whole lot of processes and people. But once we get our heads around that, we can start to put some legal mechanisms in place to address that, in my view. And then again, we have to take into account the new civil sector's priorities. Okay. So, yep, just the final key points. And threat posture is now incoherent, which I think is an opportunity. That means there's an opportunity for change. And that the mega levers, the big gears are set wrong. So that undermines any goodwill of local action. So it doesn't really matter if somebody's recycling their plastics and so forth, because the big gears if they're set wrong, we won't get there. And it is a shame that we have not tapped a body of expertise that has a whole lot of tools that we could use to do that. All right, so with that, are you ready for a different approach? Okay, so just an overview. It's a civilian-led operation with the security sector in support. So this is mobilisation, which is not militarisation. The mission is to create a safe path to safe Earth, and safe Earth for me, you know, that famous diagram is equivalent to the stabilised Earth. But it's also about the planetary boundaries, the safe operating space. It's also about safety for non-human forms of life, correcting the sixth extinction event. And it's also about human rights and security. So not the safe path means that the way that we go there is a way that cares for people and looks after people. Now, one of the benefits of having this as a new security priority is it's possibly the only thing that can override the power of economic actors who are part of the security mix now, in my analysis, not another analysis. So I think that's a fairly significant thing. This is an overview of the timing, and we go to 2100. And the idea is that Plan E is actually just the planning year, and I'm allocating a full year to planning. Because if it is a bottom-up civil response, I believe that you have to create the space and time for people to develop their sector-specific strategies and plans. So that's instead of reacting in a chaotic way, that we actually engage in deliberate planning instead of panicking and so forth. So it's envisaging and embarking. This is to get ready for Plan F, Fast and Furious, which is essentially 4 years really going hell for leather. You might have seen those TV shows, you know, the home makeover shows. So it's like that, but for the planet. Then we go to Plan G, which is Guts and Guile, Elizabeth Taylor's famous comment. That's addressing the harder aspects, because I guess it's some low-hanging fruit in the first aspect, refreshing the workplace and addressing more dangerous hyperthreat action. Then we get to Plan H, which is called Hold and Hello Health. So anticipating that this is the period where there's going to be sustained attacks by the hyperthreat. It's going to be the most difficult. So there might have to be periods of strategic withdrawal, prepared with opportunistic rapid advances. And then there's a possibility that from 2050, human ingenuity will kick in. You think we didn't have the iPhone that long ago. We are capable of invention and adaptation, and we might start getting the hang of it. And then by 2100, Plan J, dual endures, that's the dual of Earth. Safe Earth is achieved or achievable, and there's a sense of jubilation and joy. But what I want to highlight there is that Plan H is obviously a real dangerous period where things could completely, that could be the end. So what that suggests is that we need to do as much as we can in the earlier phases to prepare for that really dangerous phase. And the idea of having phases means that different people can start planning the other phases while the other ones are occurring, and this allows momentum to keep moving. Okay, the overall plan, there's 4 strategic concepts, and that forms a new force design, so completely new concept of what a security force would look like, and there's 5 major operations. So I'm just going to touch on some of the features of those now. The first thing I want to highlight is that it's a human-centered approach to threat. So this is part of this new philosophy, is that human is no longer the locus of meaning and knowledge. We're just another species. Okay, so all creatures' life and security is part of the plan. So applying that idea of entangled security, I know you can't see that diagram there, but essentially we have, instead of just state security, we have planetary and human task force in it, plus a support task force in the blue. So that's operationalizing the idea of entangled security by creating those three major task groups. And this is called orchestration logic. It doesn't necessarily mean command and control, but it means everyone can know what each other's doing. That's a blow up of it. I'll just pause in case anyone wants to get a screenshot. It is in the papers. Okay, so you might recall earlier I was talking about the enablers of the hyperthreat. So one of the things is to target those enablers. So the first one is invisibility. So when we have a line of effort, which is a major strategic objective to make the hyperthreat visible and knowable. And there's a whole task force working on that. The second one is to reduce its freedom of action. I'll talk about some ideas for that. And the third one is, well, how do we increase human speed and strength of response? And you'll see that does involve the medical sector. International relations realignment. So you may be aware that there's a lot of discussion about the so-called Western rules-based order, which has lost a lot of credibility. So it's proposed that the new rules-based order is an ecological-based order, and that potentially we could move to eco-multilateralism, whereby we focus on our particular regions, which is, you know, where the accords with the climate and the fisheries and the natural ecological boundaries of systems, rather than a human-centered political boundaries. And obviously that aligns with, you know, severe weather and so forth, and disaster response. And this also shifts away from this locus of a global control for the sort of UN approach. It's more focusing on our region, and eco-multilateralism. It relies on a planetary peace treaty. And I'm also arguing that the Western world needs to get engaged in reparations for the harm that we have done. And that might avoid the World War III. And in particular for Australians, partnership with China. So on those reparations, on the right, that's an image of Baghdad in its heyday, and reflecting the Islamic golden age. So what I'm proposing is that some of the key cities and areas that, particularly, for example, the Iraq, which was an illegal war, that one of the activities the Western world will do is assist to rebuild these areas using the latest ecological thinking and design, and help them get ready for the hyper threat. And this would obviously be done in consultation, and it might involve sending a variety of their people to Australia, for example, who engage in the latest eco-architecture courses, and they get trained in Australia, and they go back and design it the way that they want it. But at any rate, we provide funding and support to rebuild these areas that we've bombed with the most wonderful ecological technology that we can get, and fast-trained and you know, hardened in anticipation of the severe weather effects to come. And we actually guarantee their security, or do a lot to improve their security in the next century. More on international relations and that ecological rules-based order, the legal framework would be building on things that already exist, such as the UN High Seas Treaty, marine protected areas, ecocide laws, etc. And when we talk about human speed and massive response, I was thinking, one of the things I thought is, well, how do we defeat something that, like the hyper threat, which is everywhere and it's just so massive? And I thought, well, actually, we do have a lot of people. We have this massive population of 8 billion people. So how could we harness that population? And what if everybody did a little bit? So I call this the human as ant strategy. So then it becomes a question of, well, how do we harness that massive workforce? So then there becomes the idea of layered mobilisation, with a whole lot of different forms of mobilisation. So mobilisation in place, that means essentially you stay where you are. You might work at Toyota factory and you stay there and start producing e-vehicles. Soft mobilisation is the same way you might join a sporting club. You might go to some training once a Tuesday night and play a game on the weekend. So, or chess club or something like that. Just a few separate hours through the week. Structured employment is obviously the Green New Deal. Veterans, there will globally, not maybe less so in Australia, but there are masses of veterans with all this mobilisation going around the world. Where can all those people go? So it's a transition to a new workforce for a lot of those people. Then there's the employment as peacekeeping. There's a whole field of study on environmental peacekeeping. There's a whole group of people studying that, the whole stack of ideas. And the last one is Earth citizenship, which I'll just explain now. This is the concept for refugees, the so-called caravan people crossing over across to Mexico in America, and all manner of displaced people. So currently we have at least, I think it's actually now higher than 90 million, but it's growing because it's growing all the time, but at least 90 million people sitting in refugee camps. And some of them languish there for around 10 years or so, as we know. And roughly 45% are in that working age bracket, so that's 40 million. So what if we gave them the option, and it's completely optional, that they would work for the HyperResponse force? And let's just hypothetically suggest that 16 million volunteered to work for the HyperResponse force for a period of 5 years, where they get vocational training. And in return, they get something called Earth citizenship, which entitles them to settle in particular agreed countries. So that's Earth citizenship. So now there's 5 main operations. I won't read through those now because we'll touch on them as we go. Operation visibility and knowability. That's addressing that enabler. This is a major operation to make this threat something we can see and know. And one of the first aspects of that is, if you think of all our intelligence agencies, which again you pay for, and we virtually don't know what they do, they would be far more transparent, and they would be have to be redesigned or reskilled and retrained to do that intelligence analysis of an entangled security environment. So there'd be new sorts of people. For example, we think of the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO, and people who work in the water field, gathering all sorts of data and stats, and that would get fed into these new intelligence agencies who are continually analysing it and working out the interlinkages on an ongoing basis. And human security, which of course the medical field is part of, would also be feeding in their stats. And we have people, those who aren't aware, intelligence people are trained. It's a specific form of expertise to analyse and join dots between a whole series of multiple factors. So now we'll be bringing environmental and human security in, and our intelligence agencies would be reskilled. There's a whole lot of work on, scientific literacy, repairing journalism, etc., and harnessing the creative sector and so forth. I won't go into that right now. But another aspect is that part of this operation back is a group called the Point Force, and they're like a white-collar crime expertise people. So their job is really focusing on the people doing the most harm, or the most dangerous resource evils. And they actually have a function called tracking harm, which, to use a medical analogy, you know how you know more about it than me, that you give people some sort of pill, and it goes through their system, a dye, and it shows what's going on in your body to identify things. So it's sort of like that, tracking this very diffuse threat, the hyper threat, that's all through sort of offshore accounts, and really hard to find who's the decision maker and all that sort of thing. So these people would have exceptional policing, IT, legal skills, financial support, etc., to track the hyper threats actions. And actually, it doesn't mean when we find someone doing something wrong, we throw them in prison or anything like that. But actually, we try to work with them. There's an idea of a transition support team that helps those companies transition, and they may, in worst case, have to go into administrative control. Operation Beauty is protect and restore ecosystems. Massive job where a lot of those Earth citizens and all sorts. I'm imagining a workforce of maybe 80 million people. Right. That job is to rescue Ally 1. Our most important ally is nature, who's struggling at the moment, hanging on by a thread. So the more we can strengthen nature, our main ally, the more it helps us. So this is a real priority. And it's just really putting a whole stack more resources into a lot of activities that already exist. One aspect of this is there's a term in military theory or practice called vital ground. And that when people say for it, and actually it does occur that, for example, offshore oil rigs off the coast of Western Australia might be considered vital ground or vital assets. So once they're allocated as that means that's trigger, that word, for them to have special security support. So in fact, we work out with advice from ecologists what are the most crucial ecological areas that need urgent protection, and they're ecological vital ground. So they're of vital planetary importance, and they're given really strong planetary protection. That's Tiger Protection Unit and Patrol in Indonesia, water poaching. These machines that pick up rubbish. This is the sort of work people are doing off duty, restoring lands. And that's in Thailand, actually, where they run an all-female park ranger force in their country people through really fast. Again, expanding that sort of work. Okay, Operation UNET. So this goes back to the problem with material security. You know how material security is entangled with systems maintenance, etc. So the idea is that we're entangled in this fossil fuel destructive violence producing system, but we can't get off it. It's like a net that we're tied up in. We can't get off it until there's a new net, like a safety net that we can get the civilian population in. So this operation is to build the new net so people can get off the old polluting, dangerous net. And essentially that's all the reform of industry, rural areas, urban areas, mega cities, in the food waste, energy, eco design, zero emissions design. Already a lot of work exists in this area. A whole of society industry response. A new player to this area is the defence industry that has quite phenomenal technological engineering, research and development and design capacity that can be reorientated, and that talent and skill and capacity can be reorientated to a new security mission. Okay, Operation Sapiens Star. So to achieve this enormous mission, which in fact is on planetary scale, the Operation Sapiens Star has to optimize Homo sapiens' capability, well-being and health, and create the strongest hyper-response force possible, because we have an enormous task ahead of us. But it's not just physical strength to achieve this mission, which is significant on the galactic scale. It's also about our morality and who we are. And it's basically about this idea that the human being's evolution is not finished. That in fact, the current type of human being, Homo sapien, which sort of fights over resources and so forth, is sort of pretty, primitive sort of being, and that we're still evolving. And in fact, that we're going to become a type of human being that instead of being ashamed of who we are, like you talk in the climate space, you often hear people saying, it's embarrassing, it's shameful how we behave, a bloody human being. Why don't we just wipe us off and give nature a chance? You hear people say those sort of things. But actually, we start to be proud of who we are because of what we're doing. And we become actually significant in the universe. And all these aliens and other forms of life, they hear about how these Homo sapiens brought Earth back from the brink. And Homo sapiens start to completely starve because of what we achieved at the end hour. Now, so just going back to the medical sector, if you look at the human population, would you say that we're up to this mission at the moment? When you think of obesity, drug taking, heart disease, all sorts of problems. So the mission that simply would be given to the medical sector is get everyone as healthy as you possibly can. And let's start with a complete blank page. Going back to nutrition, preventative health, what barriers and diverse incentives exist. And say, for example, that the health sector came back and said, look, these sort of preservatives in food or these hidden fats and sugars are creating a massive load on the medical sector, which is going to unnecessarily overburden us at a time when we're going to be absolutely smashed with work. We need them gone. That you would get listened to, because it's actually an operational imperative to take the load off, unnecessary load off the medical sector, and get people as strong and healthy as we can. So there's another group called the Home Force, and this is the idea that people who stay in their local area or at their home and do things like grow vegetables or or have businesses at home and so forth, they're actually making an enormous contribution to the HyperResponse because they're reducing those long supply chains. So the home force would become people who are paid and working in that area because of the significance, and the enormous R&D, the size of sort of a new fighter jet, that type of scale of investment would go into working out how to the home front. And this is perhaps where the feminism is coming into it. Let's put research and development into addressing the hyper threat at the local level, in the home, in the community. The mums would be involved in this, okay, working with the best designers, and parents. Okay, Wide Wings provides exceptional levels of safety and support across planetary, human and state security spheres during disasters and emergencies to match new hyper-threat realities. And enhance effective security, that's how people feel, and maintain hyper-responsible strength. So we have to protect everyone as much as we can when these hits are coming. Part of it is the idea that when things inevitably get knocked down, as they will, that we don't rebuild with the old fossil fuel, heavy sort of old design. But in fact, we have these new things called eco-rebuild squads who go in, consult with the community, understand the ecology of the area, and develop, the very best eco zero emission designs we can that are hardened for future weather impacts. And of course, we're also thinking of the survivability of the non-human and creating more capabilities in that area. And this is an area I don't think is really being touched that much, and it might be something the military industrial complex could bring to the table, is engineering solutions for really, really severe extreme weather events. So you can see there, this is this portable bridge that one over the river there. They have these in battles. When a bridge is blown up, they can actually airdrop these things in or deliver them on a truck, and they fold out, and suddenly you have a bridge. There could be all sorts of contraptions that we flow in or land in that suddenly provide shade, or suddenly provide a bridge, or suddenly provide some elevated ground so that a herd of cattle is not going to drown and elevates them up. But you get a whole stack of engineering, eco-disaster, eco-survivability people to start nutting out solutions to protect life during those extreme events. Dropping in housing, etc. So just reiterating the timing there. The Plan E is a year of deliberate planning, and then we're going into 4 years of action. And that's a sort of example of a recruitment poster. It's time humanity going from being a destructive force to a remarkable restorative force. And 4 billion people will form a counteraction to the menacing hyper-threat. Sign up.
I'm very sorry to interrupt you, Liz, but I am also thinking a bit about time because we're at the hour mark now. Okay. So can you maybe just...
Wrap up?
Yes, please.
So that's, I beg your pardon, sorry, looking at my watch incorrectly.
Oh, no, you're absolutely fascinating to listen to. Please don't worry about that at all.
Anyway, so that's the end here. So I'll just end the slide. So that was actually the end. So, stop sharing.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Liz. I missed the time thing. That really was absolutely fascinating, Liz. Thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts with us. And, it's just so rich and there's so much to unpack in there. But, I think, everybody on this call absolutely sees the planetary health disaster as a threat. And I think that framing, using the word violence and slow violence and saying that it's, I use the word emergency a lot, but, when you think about this as a violence being perpetuated upon us, then, it sort of shifts the way your brain works, doesn't it? It kind of shifts your response to it. And I'm imagining is that something that happened to you when you first started, like in your paper, you talk about the Black Summer fires and, was it then? Was that when you internally kind of, that was the seed?
I would say the seed for me was I used to work in Sudan in actually some hospitals with the severely malnourished and quite up front with starving people. And so when I first read about climate change and heard about food security, that image went straight in my mind, and from that moment I saw it as I suddenly had images of that situation occurring much more widely around the world. So I think from then that's when I saw it as a threat.
Yeah.
But I think it opens up the whole legal space, that as soon as it's defined as killing, there's a whole lot of untapped legal tools that we have. It changes the dynamic, it changes the permissiveness of what's occurring.
Yeah, that's it, because we somehow we've got this sort of lukewarm response where we just keep not paying enough attention, like paying some attention, but not enough attention, enough to kind of placate us, but not enough to solve it, and I suppose you talk about Plan E as being the mobilisation, or the sort of, it's almost like a diagnosis phase, to try and put a medical kind of term onto it, about saying, this is the problem we're facing. We have to stop making it worse. We have to understand that this problem is real and here and now. And I suppose that might be something where we can kind of help on that, Liz. That seems like quite a sort of medical way, or, way through for us. Because I suppose, I'm very interested in where we take your thoughts. Like, you've done work with military here. Like, do you get a soundboard? Are people, do people hear it?
It's to be honest, there's I suppose much the same as the climate activists getting arrested. There's quite a lot of doors shut to this, because it challenges AUKUS and it challenges the current way of doing things. But the various community groups and different goodwill people from different areas have opened doors. So, but probably not enough. And I think it is being silenced. And it would be, I think that this is a start point, and I'm just one brain, but what it really needs is a whole stack of brains around it. And it would be fascinating to see. There's no doubt for sort of diagnostic emergency planning tools within the medical sector that could be brought to bear the problem. So I think what the thing for me, I guess the key message I'd like to give is, I think that there's hope, because at the moment, the hyperthreat has the security sector, the state and the security sector behind it. But imagine if that turned and came behind it, behind the HyperResponse. And imagine if we could take the cap off all those skills across the brain power of our whole society. I think there'd be an explosion of energy and ingenuity that we wouldn't, it'd be breathtaking.
It would be breathtaking. And, when you talk about emergency declarations, the whole concept of an emergency declaration really is meant to act on the emergency, to say, okay, yeah, you're right, it really is an emergency, we should treat it like one. And yet, we make emergency declarations and then don't kind of meet that planning. And, I suppose, so do you have hope then that the military will, like the collective global military, which is, to try and get agreement amongst all these disparate actors, seems to me, a really big barrier. But do you hope that there's some kind of transformative moment where they realise, okay, we're all in this together and we have to act together, meet this challenge, otherwise civilization collapses?
I actually think we're seeing a shift at the moment, with people all around the world protesting about the Palestinian Gaza situation, and even the fact that many so-called right-wing people really have had enough of wars. There's an understanding now that they're sort of making fat cats fatter, and they're not really in the interest of the public. But we've had the forever wars. There's a disillusionment with the current approach on many, many ways. So I think we could be at the era of the birth of a whole new approach to security, which is, security people do, I think, like medical people, we don't work for profit. We work, people, there's a lot of honour associated. People like protecting the community. They like to feel they're doing the right thing, and they don't like to be the bad guy. So realigning it with that protective instinct and genuine, there's a whole stack of people who love protecting the community. It gets them out of bed in the morning. There is a possibility there. I think from my perspective, at brain science, it tells us that the main thing is to get a new, a dominant narrative, which is a new idea out there, because when the new idea gets enough people agree with it, you sort of get that 100th monkey shift. But unfortunately, this idea hasn't got out there because we are in a narrative-controlled battle. And I thank you again for creating space for it, for a new idea. But that's the battle. That's how I'm fighting this battle, is narrative warfare, because I think it discredits the current approach, and that's perhaps one way we can get some traction.
So agree. And, you know, that concept of the Overton window of shifting the narrative as to what is possible, you know, and, you know, we see that change a lot, don't we? You know, we have, you know, COVID was a great example where things changed on a dime because we saw the need and then we did it, you know, and certainly, you know, medicine, we all came together globally for COVID. And, you know, certainly, and I'd like to see medicine come together globally for climate, and recognizing that, you know, we need to treat it with the same cooperation and vigor and seriousness. But I suppose, you know, we're the boiling frogs in the pot on the stove, and that slows us down. There's been some great comments and questions in the chat, Liz, and one of the things that keeps coming up really is, how do we help you? You know, what would be the next steps for you? You know, how does this, you know, if you could give us you know, how can we help you, Liz?
Well, perhaps writing to the local members or the TILs, you know, saying have a look at this. Can we get it on the table? Because say, for example, that massive defence budget, if we just had 1%, a tiny amount allocated to support deliberate planning next year across all of society, we could get moving. And that really defence and the security sector should be developing at least contingency options. And there's not even a contingency option being developed. So perhaps sharing this idea and contacting local members. I'm not very clued up in lobbying, to be honest. I can see the expertise in the group, but I think it's getting the idea out there, and you know, word of mouth. I think, you know, I actually am shadow banned a fair bit of the time on Twitter, I find. So I actually word of mouth helps me a lot. You know, this is the reality of the world that we're living in. The hyperthreat is controlling our communication, so we have to go back to basics. But if other people have got other ideas, I'm very welcome to, you know, I'm all ears to hear them.
Oh, you're really generous, Liz. A lot of people would love to have some copies of your slides, and if that's available, if you wanted to, if that's okay with you, certainly this will be recorded and shared. And you know, I think we all share that sense that the time is now to mobilise to save our planet. And, you know, certainly you're obviously a deep thinker around this and have developed this way through for us. And, you know, that gives hope. And I think one of the things we all do need is hope. And, you know, I was very heartened to hear you say that you have hope. I thought that was a good thing. I was going to ask you if you did, but you do. So that's good. I have hope too, but I also think that we need to just be getting on and doing now. Stop kicking the can. Yeah. All right. And so, look, thank you very much again, Liz. I'm going to stop recording, and get people to figuratively clap for Liz too.